The December debate, hosted by PBS NewsHour and Politico, was the 6th Democratic primary debate for the 2020 election cycle and last of 2019. In attendance were Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Andrew Yang, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer. While some of the most aggressive debaters in the race, like Julian, Castro, and Tulsi Gabbard, sat this one out, significant clashes did occur, mainly in the latter half of the event. For me, the back and forths are the most important parts of debates. Not only are they inherently more interesting, and thus more likely to be watched over and over again, but when done right, they show us a side of the candidates that are often missed in forums, rallies, and interviews. The debates are the only events in which candidates appear together on stage, so I don't think it too bold to postulate that their interactions are what really matter most. In this video, I will break down what I take to be the 5 biggest moments of the 6th Democratic debate, 5 moments of conflict that appear especially definitive or instructive for the campaigns of the Democratic primary candidates. I'll talk about the conflicts between Biden and Sanders, Sanders and Klobuchar, Buttigieg and Klobuchar, Buttigieg and Warren, and Sanders and the moderators. While in my last video about this debate, I attempted to focus on public perception, in this video I'll hone in more on what I take to be the truth. I'll identify what I take to be good and bad arguments, and clarify the facts of the matter where necessary, all in attempts to provide an answer to this question: what happened? While I am going to attempt to be as fair as possible throughout this discussion, I would like to note my bias up front. Sanders is currently my favorite candidate in the race, and you can generally qualify me as a social democrat. So where I share an opinion, that's the perspective I'm coming from, but of course I welcome your opinions as well, so please share your views in the comments. But before we get into that, let me begin this video by thanking my wonderful patrons without whom this video would hardly be possible. Sergio Guerrero, Emil Sierbeck-Moller, Victor Holmberg, Torch Camaro, CMAC, Charlotte Holden, Thomas Lamser, David Goodrich, Adam Riordan, Louise Dencuro, Jack Stokes, Question Time Fanac 2020, Ryan Judge, Sir Bobbitt, Christopher Green Nordeer, Matthew Garish, Ahigao Comics, Blake Mallon, Maxwell Verkulen, Sarah Parker Schmilt, Mike Lodato, Darian Kennedy, Kyle Strong, Sam Robinson, Darren Fry, Clayton Gibson, Matthias Drager, and Jeremy. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so at patreon.com/questiontime. The great Google in the cloud has also recently informed me that this channel is finally eligible for channel memberships. So if you'd be interested in supporting the channel in that way, let me know in the comments down below and I'll be sure to get that set up. If you want to support this channel but don't have any scratch to give, you can always help get the word out by sharing, liking, and commenting on these videos, and by subscribing and turning on your notifications. Perhaps especially because I'm still a relatively small-time creator, everything you guys do to help support me means a lot. I really appreciate each and every one of you, and I love talking to you guys in the comments. 2019 has been a huge year of growth for this channel, and I quite literally owe it all to you guys. So to each and every one of you, whether you support this channel financially or just watch these videos when they pop up in your feed, thank you. Alright, let's get into it. Let's begin by talking about a conflict that emerged over a top issue, healthcare, between the top 2 candidates, Bernie versus Biden. This began with a question directed to Sanders about the practicality of passing a Medicare for All plan.
Moving to healthcare, an issue that voters tell us every day is still the #1 priority for them. Senator Sanders, you've spent plenty of time discussing and defending the merits of your Medicare for All plan, but the reality is that if Republicans retain control of the U.S. Senate, or even if Democrats win back a narrow Senate majority, your plan as constituted probably would not have the votes to pass Congress.
Okay, let's just acknowledge the assumptions baked into this question already. While Republicans seem to recurrently manage to overcome the filibuster, Tim Alberta is taking it at face value that either Democrats can't overcome the filibuster, which has been historically true, though this deserves to be called out, or that moderate and conservative Democrats would refuse to vote for their president's healthcare bill. That latter issue is also a very real potentiality, but again deserves to be called out. Democrats do sometimes have trouble controlling their members, but this is a status quo that deserves to be fought against. Progressive Democrats routinely vote for bills pushed by moderate Dems. I don't see why it's accepted as an immutable, morally neutral fact that centrists will buck the agenda of their own party's leader if that leader is a progressive.
So the question, Senator, is if Congress rejects your plan, and the American people are looking to you for leadership on this issue, Are there smaller, specific measures that you would take immediately to expand coverage and decrease costs?
Now here's the other problem with the question. Tim Alberta assumes that if a Democratic caucus refuses to support a progressive agenda, it's incumbent on the president to water down their policies, when in fact the president also has the option to use the bully pulpit to fight for change. Sanders actually has a plan to do this, which is to encourage a grassroots movement to support the passage of his progressive agenda. Beyond this, even were Sanders intent on negotiating away certain provisions of his healthcare plan in order to get it passed, if he wants to get the strongest bill possible, it would be pretty foolish of him to publicly concede now, even before his agenda meets with any resistance. The fact of the matter is, if you want to do well in a negotiation, you don't want to enter the negotiation having pre-conceded any part of your ideal position.
Well, Tim, at a time when we're spending twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other nation, when 87 million people are uninsured or underinsured, when 30,000 people are dying each year because they don't get to a doctor when they should, and when 500,000 people are going bankrupt because of the dysfunctional and cruel system that we currently have, you know what? I think we will pass a Medicare for all single-payer system, and I will introduce that legislation in my first week in office. Now, to answer your question, I think when we go out to the American people and tell them that right now we have got to take on the greed and corruption of the pharmaceutical industry, for example, which in some cases charges us 10 times more for the same exact drug as is charged in this country. When the American people understand that Medicare for All expands Medicare to cover home health care, dental care, eyeglasses, and hearing aids, and does it at a cost far, far lower than what some of my opponents are talking about, you know what? We're going to have the American people behind us. We will have Congress behind us.
Thank you, Senator Sanders.
Okay, so my only issue with what Sanders said here was saying that his bill does this at a cost far, far lower than what some of his opponents are talking about. So first, it's not totally clear, but he's not talking about taxes, obviously. It's a little ambiguous, but he could be interpreted as talking about healthcare costs for the average middle-class taxpayer, in which case what he would be saying would be true. Only Warren's plan claims to be cheaper in terms of overall healthcare costs for middle-class families, as she proposes to provide universal coverage without a middle-class tax increase. If, on the other hand, he's talking about the total cost of healthcare in the United States, then it's reasonable for him to be making this argument, but it's not necessarily true. The CBO has not produced a cost estimate for his Medicare for All bill. Various economists and think tanks have produced cost estimates, and they vary quite wildly. The Urban Institute, a Washington policy research group, estimates that a Medicare for All system would expand healthcare expenditures from just below 18% of GDP up to around 21% of GDP. Gerald Friedman, a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, expects a reduction of healthcare spending to well below 14% of GDP. Of course, everyone's analyses should come with a grain of salt. Friedman received criticism in 2016 for being overly optimistic about the economic proposals of Bernie Sanders at the time. He was even accused of being affiliated with the Sanders campaign, although it was later found that he was actually a supporter of Hillary Clinton. The Urban Institute, while largely funded by the federal government, foundations, and nonprofits, receives 6.3% of its funding from corporations. Some of these foundations and nonprofits appear to be in part means to funnel corporate money into the Urban Institute in ways that may bias their analysis. Just as a quick example, I was able to discover by glancing at their financial disclosures, a top multi-year contributor to the Urban Institute is the Blue Cross Blue Shield Massachusetts Foundation. This may shock you, but that organization was created and is funded by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, a private health insurance company. Sanders' Medicare for All plan is quite obviously expected to harm the private health insurance industry. The reality is that even were everyone involved an honest broker, which they most certainly are not, the exact change in the total cost of healthcare is very difficult to predict, as the change to the system would be rather dramatic. The biggest differences between different projections emerge from different estimates of how the new system would pay doctors, hospitals, and other medical providers. No number, including Biden's $30 trillion figure, is really all that reliable. At the core of both anti-Medicare for All and pro-Medicare for All arguments, I believe, are not cost estimates, but ideological differences. Those against the overhaul are likely more fearful of big changes than they are outraged by problems in the current system. Those advocating for the change are willing to bet that the United States is capable of doing what most other major countries have done, and provide a single-payer system that costs less and provides more per person than the current U.S. system.
Vice President Biden, I'd like to bring you in. You spent an awful lot of time 10 years ago trying to pass a bill far less ambitious than what Senator Sanders is talking about here. Is he being realistic?
I don't think it is realistic, but let me explain why. I introduced a plan to build on Obamacare. Remind everybody, 20 million people got insurance, didn't have it before. All people with pre-existing conditions are able to be covered. I could go on. We didn't get all that we wanted. But now that it's been exposed, that taking it away has such dire consequences, I've added to the Obamacare plan the Biden initiative, which is a public option, Medicare, if you want to have Medicare, for reducing significantly the price of drugs, deductibles, et cetera, by underwriting the plan to a tune of about $750 billion, and making sure that we're able to cover everyone who is in fact able to be covered.
Just to note here, you may be wondering, why is he saying everyone who can be covered? Well, that's because according to Biden's own campaign, some Americans will not get insurance. They estimate his plan will insure 97% of Americans.
Hey, put your hand down for a second, Bernie, okay?
Just waving to you, Joe.
I know.
Saying hello.
I know. So look.
Okay, that was just a weird moment for all involved.
It covers everybody, it's realistic, and most importantly, it lets you choose what you want.
Okay, he just said it covers everybody, but according to his own website, again, it doesn't, albeit by a somewhat thin margin.
Here, you have 160 million people who negotiated their health care plans with their employer, like many of you have. You may or may not like it. If you don't like it, you can move into the public option that I propose in my plan. But if you like it, you shouldn't have Washington dictating to you. You cannot keep the plan you have.
Thank you, Vice President Biden.
Good night.
Senator Sanders, 45 seconds to respond.
Okay, I don't think there's anything new there.
Under Joe's plan, essentially, we retain the status quo.
That's not true.
No,
It is exactly
right.
true. Thank you. And
It's really a matter of perspective. Biden's plan does make a fairly significant change, but it's not nearly as different as a Medicare for All plan. The public option keeps the private employer-based healthcare system intact and provides a potential bridge towards single payer. Bernie's plan is single payer.
by the way, Joe, under your plan, you asked me how we're going to pay for it. Under your plan, I'll tell you how we're paying for it right now. The average worker in America, their family makes $60,000 a year. That family is now paying $12,000 a year for health care, 20% of their income. Under Medicare for All, that family will be paying $1,200 a year because we're eliminating the profiteering of the drug companies and the insurance companies and ending this Byzantine and complex administration of thousands of separate healthcare plans.
Sanders does a good job here explaining that part of the cost saving of the Medicare for All system comes from eliminating bureaucracy. It's actually an appealing argument to make, particularly from a democratic socialist. In terms of the actual costs he explains, it should be noted that because the exact cost of Medicare for All is still in dispute, establishing a tax plan that will necessarily fully fund the program is an impossible task. With the specific goal of funding Medicare for All in mind, Sanders has released multiple press releases explaining ways that additional revenue could be raised, mainly, of course, off the backs of corporations and the wealthy. The most commonly cited plan is an employer-side payroll tax hike of 7.5 percentage points, projected to raise approximately $3.9 trillion over 10 years. That tax burden would likely be passed on to the employees, even though it is assessed on employers. Based on current averages of healthcare insurance contributions assessed by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the payroll tax would amount to less overall healthcare costs for workers earning below $80,000 per year, but progressively higher for higher income individuals. For families, that cutoff point would be an annual income of $194,000. Of course, that's assuming that the payroll tax is the only tax put onto average workers, While the plan is unlikely to cover the full cost of Medicare for all, a Sanders administration would plausibly fund the rest of the plan on taxes that do not apply to average income families.
Senator Klobuchar, I'm going to come to you.
My name was mentioned.
Yes, I'm going to come to you, but 45 seconds. 45 seconds for Vice President Biden.
That's not interrupted here, all right? I'm going to interrupt now. It costs $30 trillion. Let's get that straight. $30 trillion over 10 years.
Again, we don't know that exactly, which Biden acknowledges.
Some say it costs $20 trillion. Some say it costs $40. The idea that you're going to be able to save that person making $60,000 a year on Medicare for all is absolutely preposterous. 16% of the American public is on Medicare now, and everybody has a tax taken out of their paycheck now. Tell me, you're going to add 84% more, and there's not going to be higher taxes? At least before he was honest about it.
What I think Biden is missing here is where the additional revenue would be generated beyond new taxes on the middle class. Again, Sanders has laid out multiple options that generally raise taxes on the wealthy, but not average income people.
It's going to increase personal taxes. They're going to be...
That's right. We are going to increase personal taxes. Okay. But we're eliminating premiums. We're eliminating co-payments. We're eliminating deductibles. We're eliminating all out-of-pocket expenses. And no family in America will spend more than $200 a year on prescription drugs.
Senator Klobuchar.
Our plan will save the average worker far more.
Senator Klobuchar, we'd like to hear from you.
Yes, Senator Klobuchar, pay premiums or co-payments.
Okay, that's the end of that clash between Sanders and Biden. If you've been watching all the debates, I don't think you heard much new there from either candidate, aside from small nuances. Neither really distorted the facts or embarrassed themselves, but neither did anything particularly new or special either. Even though this exchange felt heated, I don't think either took damage or made gains as a result. The discussion over healthcare here actually gets a lot more interesting when it shifts into being a debate between Bernie Sanders and Amy Klobuchar. So this begins with Klobuchar interjecting. She talks about her own support for a public option plan, is generally critical about there being a heated debate about the issues, and she makes an argument that I've heard her and other moderate Democrats make a number of times.
But where I disagree is I just don't think anyone has a monopoly on bold ideas. I think you can be progressive and practical at the same time. That is why I favor a public option.
That's not a very good argument in my view. Even though I support Medicare for all, I would like to acknowledge that there are good arguments for a public option. For instance, along similar lines to what Biden often argues, you could say, look, the current US healthcare system is basically the most conservative in the world. Bernie's plan is more progressive than the Canadian system. A massive overhaul of a huge sector of the economy overnight is virtually impossible. With a public option, you can get to near universal coverage immediately and begin reducing healthcare costs. But you also have the advantage of allowing the public bureaucracy required to administer a national healthcare insurance program the time needed to develop effectively. Medicare administrators would have a chance to gain experience and recruit new people. Private companies would have the time to gradually divest from health insurance into other areas. That might be a better argument, but the talking point that you can be progressive and practical, bold and boring at the same time is extremely unappealing, I think. I would like to call this the fruit for dessert argument. You want ice cream? Sounds delicious. But how about a nice wedge of orange instead? It tastes just as good as ice cream, but it's healthy. Sorry, but this is America. Americans on the whole, I think, want the ice cream. America didn't land on the moon or set the most Guinness World Records or build the most powerful military in the world or develop the double down fried chicken sandwich with a national character that favors restraint and moderation. For better and for worse, America is a country of big ideas and bold actions. Tofu burgers are not bacon double cheeseburgers, and selling them as such, I believe, just doesn't work. Anyway, let's skip ahead to where Klobuchar directly confronts Sanders.
Your fight, Bernie, is not with me or with Vice President Biden. It is with all those bunch of those new House members, not everyone by any means, that got elected in that last election in the Democratic Party. It is with the new governor, Democratic governor of Kentucky, that wants to build on Obamacare. And the way I look at it, if you want to cross a river over some troubled waters, you build a bridge, you don't blow one up.
Okay, so her argument here is not about public options being better, nor is it about them being more expedient to create. This argument is about political expedience. The reason we shouldn't fight for Medicare for all, according to her argument, is that a number of Democratic public officials won't support the idea. It's not a particularly original idea either, but it's about as uninspiring as the fruit for dessert argument. It proposes that the policies we fight for be tempered in the first place by practicality. Obviously, compromise should be considered when trying to get legislation passed, but I think this is strategically misguided as a means to develop policy in the first place. I think you don't want to water down ideas before you arrive at the negotiating table. You should begin the fight with the best version of what you want and negotiate as needed where possible.
And I think that we should build on the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Warren, we would like to bring you in.
She took my name in vain.
Oh.
She hurt my feelings. I am crushed. Can I respond?
Never.
So this response by Bernie is one of the reasons I thought this was a very good debate for him. Even though he has serious problems with the arguments she's presenting, he begins this rebuttal lightheartedly and affably, joking around. To her credit, Klobuchar matches his tone, also a reason she was able to do well in this debate.
My fight,
45 seconds, Senator Steyer.
Right. My fight, Amy, is not with the governor of Kentucky. My fight and all of our fights must be with the greed and corruption of the pharmaceutical industry, with the greed and corruption of the insurance industry. These guys last year made $100 billion in profit, and tens of millions of Americans cannot afford to go to a doctor tonight. The day has got to come, and Joe is not talking about it, Amy is not talking about it. The day has got to come, and I will bring that day about when we finally say to the drug companies and the insurance companies, the function of healthcare is to provide it for all of our people in a cost-effective way, not to make massive profits for the drug companies and the insurance companies.
Okay, so that concludes the debate over healthcare, and Sanders delivers a very strong argument for his plan, interestingly, without mentioning any specifics of his plan. The essence of the argument is about what the function of the healthcare system should be. Currently, he argues, it's about corporate profits, whereas it should be about providing people with cost-effective healthcare. It's kind of hard to argue with that point. In fact, I believe supporters of the public option would agree. But the fact that Sanders is making this point, whereas Biden and Klobuchar, as he indicates, aren't making this point, makes it seem like only Medicare for all actually takes on that system of corporate greed. That's only partially true. A public option would as well, just to a lesser extent. At any rate, it's a strong argument and a strong moment for Sanders. While I think in this exchange Sanders shined a little brighter than did Klobuchar, she was not significantly damaged by it. Certainly not so much as to overpower her generally good performance throughout this debate, the highlight of which was no doubt her forceful confrontation with Pete Buttigieg. This conflict began with what I take to be a strong run by Klobuchar.
I look at this a different way. When we were in the last debate, Mayor, you basically mocked the 100 years of experience on the stage.
But enough about Bernie Sanders.
And what do I see on this stage? I see Elizabeth's work starting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and helping 29 million people. I see the vice president's work in getting $2 billion for his cancer moonshot. I see Senator Sanders' work working to get the veterans bill passed across the aisle. And I see what I've done, which is to negotiate 3 farm bills and be someone that actually had major provisions put in those bills. So while you can dismiss committee hearings, I think this experience works.
Here, despite the fact that Klobuchar's farm bills might seem somewhat weak in comparison to some of the accomplishments of other candidates that she mentioned, I think this was one of Amy Klobuchar's best moments in a debate, full stop. Moderate Democrats have often and loudly called for party unity, often to criticize progressives criticizing more conservative members. Progressives are often irritated by these calls when at the same time you have Hillary Clinton and her surrogates, for example, attacking progressives, or Barack Obama privately promising to intervene in the primary to stop Sanders if necessary. But in this moment, Klobuchar showed a willingness to praise her opponents, progressive and moderate alike. She's not making a hollow call for party unity, she's doing it. With a small risk of being politically inexpedient, highlighting very real accomplishments of her primary rivals, she demonstrates real leadership in acknowledging these things. I really think this moment made her look good.
And I have not denigrated your experience as a local official. I have been one. I just think you should respect our experience when you look at how you evaluate someone who can get things done.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Mayor, I'll give you a chance to respond.
You actually did denigrate my experience, Senator.
Of course, he's right about that. In the press, she denigrated his experience, saying that a woman with his level of experience would not have been able to make the debate stage. She might easily be seen as having just denigrated his experience right there and then, by implication, in highlighting the accomplishments of Warren, Biden, and Sanders, but not mentioning anything he's done.
And it was before the break, and I was going to let it go because we got bigger fish to fry here. But you implied
I don't
that my
think we have bigger fish to fry than picking a president of the United States.
You're right.
That's just silly. All of this is about that. She's kind of putting words in his mouth there.
And before the break, you seemed to imply that my relationship to the First Amendment was a talking point, as if anyone up here has any more or less commitment to the Constitution than anybody else up here. Let me tell you about my relationship to the First Amendment. It is part of the Constitution that I raised my right hand and swore to defend with my life. That is my experience, and it may not be the same as yours, but it counts, Senator. It counts.
Okay, I don't know if that's effective or not. People like veterans, and it probably helps him to mention his service often, but I felt like this was a little off topic.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Senator Klobuchar, you have 45 seconds to respond.
I certainly respect your military experience. That's not what this is about. This is about choosing a president. And I know my view of this is I know you ran to be chair of the Democratic National Committee. That's not something that I wanted to do. I want to be president of the United States.
That's a pretty solid burn. It's digging at the fact that he's ambitiously gone after a number of higher offices and pursued them unsuccessfully. This is where Klobuchar begins shifting the conversation from experience to electability.
And the point is, we should have someone heading up this ticket that has actually won and been able to show that they can gather the support that you talk about of moderate Republicans and independents, as well as a fired up Democratic base. And not just done it once, I have done it 3 times. I think winning matters. I think a track record of getting things done matters. And I also think showing our party that we can actually bring people with us, have a wider tent, have a bigger coalition, and yes, longer coattails, that matters.
Thank you, Senator.
By the way, in case you're unfamiliar with the expression by longer coattails, she's referring to the coattail effect, the tendency of popular party leaders to attract votes to other candidates in the same party, in effect allowing candidates for Congress, for instance, to ride the coattails of a popular presidential candidate.
I got to respond to that. Senator, I know that if you just go by vote totals, maybe what goes on in my city seems small to you.
He's used this "what goes on in my city may seem small" line in past debates. I'm a little concerned that it sounds rather rehearsed and somewhat insincere at this point.
If you want to talk about the capacity to win, try putting together a coalition to bring you back to office with 80% of the vote as a gay dude in Mike Pence's Indiana.
15 seconds.
That's a pretty strong argument about his own electoral accomplishments within the city of South Bend, but despite the cheers of the crowd, Pete looks a little nervous, almost as if he was anticipating this devastating blow.
Again, if you had won in Indiana, that would be one thing. You tried and you lost by 20 points.
But let's talk about how we win.
Excuse me.
It was actually 25 points. This was a reference to Pete's race for Treasurer of State in Indiana in 2010. According to Data for Progress, out of all statewide elections since 1996, Pete's loss here was the worst, second only to David L. Johnson's loss to Richard Lugar for Senate in 2000. This was a tough blow to end that scuffle with. While Klobuchar and the 3 top polling candidates have all repeatedly won statewide contests, Klobuchar argues that Buttigieg's proven electability extends only to the edges of his small city. Throughout this exchange, I felt that Klobuchar's attacks were far more effective than Pete's defense, and he failed to really land anything serious on the senator. If she took any damage at all, it might be from the fact that she's rehashing an argument that probably should have happened in the November debate. Conversely, the challenges to Pete's experience and electability are significant points. Getting elected as mayor does not mean you're electable as a president. Serving as a mayor does not necessarily mean you're ready to be president. While Pete's talked about his experience in the past, I've never seen him explain how being the mayor of South Bend has really prepared him for the highest office in the land. And I think Amy hit him here exactly where he is most vulnerable. Unfortunately for Mayor Pete, this was not his only heated exchange for the night. And while the other seemed to be a more balanced joust, at least from my perspective, he took damage there as well. So let's talk about Pete Buttigieg versus Elizabeth Warren.
You know, I made the decision when I decided to run not to do business as usual. And now I'm crowding in on 100,000 selfies. That's 100,000 hugs and handshakes and stories.
Small point, but this was Warren's first of a couple references to selfies in this debate, and as you can see, the crowd reacted to it with laughter, as they did whenever selfies were mentioned. Her campaign apparently thought talking about selfies would make her seem relatable or in touch with the youth, but I think this missed the mark.
Stories from people who are struggling with student loan debt, stories from people who can't pay their medical bills, stories from people who can't find childcare. Now, most of the people on this stage run a traditional campaign, and that means going back and forth from coast to coast to rich people and people who can put up $5,000 or more in order to have a picture taken, in order to have a conversation, and in order maybe to be considered to be an ambassador.
Thank you, Senator Warren.
Those selfies, no, I want to finish this. Those selfies cost nobody anything. And I get it. In a democracy, we all have a lot of different points of view, and everybody gets one vote. But here's the thing. People who can put down $5,000 to have a picture taken don't have the same priorities as people who are struggling with student loan debt or are struggling to pay off medical debt. I'm running a campaign where people whose voices get heard. We can't have,
Thank you, Senator Warren.
We can't have people who can put down $5,000 for a check, drown out the voices of everyone else.
Thank you, Senator
Warren. They don't in my campaign, and they
Mayor
won't
Buttigieg.
in my White House.
Now, since Warren already called out Buttigieg on his fundraising in the past, as I mentioned in my predictions video for this debate, it's obvious to all that she's implicitly directing this criticism in his direction. Tim Alberta no doubt picked up on this as well.
Mayor Buttigieg, you had your hand raised. Can't help but feel that might have been directed at me.
Yep.
And here's the thing. We're in the fight of our lives right now. Donald Trump and his allies have made it abundantly clear that they will stop at nothing, not even foreign interference, to hold on to power. They've already put together more than $300 million. This is our chance. This is our only chance to defeat Donald Trump. And we shouldn't try to do it with one hand tied behind our back.
So his point here is that raising money from big money donors is necessary and that campaign money is needed to defeat Trump, who has raised a lot himself. Interestingly, this argument would not have applied a few months ago when Warren promised to reject big money in the primaries, but would be willing to accept it in the general election. In October, however, she reversed that decision, declaring that she would not do the big money fundraisers for the general election either. This came after her campaign managed to raise a strong $24.6 million in the previous quarter, well ahead of Joe Biden, but still slightly lagging behind the most effective fundraiser in the race, Bernie Sanders, although she has since seen steep declines.
The way we're going to win is to bring everybody to our side in this fight. If that means that you're a grad student digging deep to go online to PeteForAmerica.com and chip in $10, that's great. And if you can drop $1,000 without blinking, that's great too. We need everybody's help in this fight. I'm not going to turn away anyone who wants to help us defeat Donald Trump. We need Democrats who've been with us all along, yes, but we also need independents worried about the direction of the country. If you were a Republican, disgusted with what's going on in your own party, we're not going to agree on everything, but we need you in this fight, and I will welcome you to our side. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Senator Warren, 45 seconds to respond.
At the end there, Buttigieg seemed to shift from the discussion of big money versus small money donors to relatively safer but less relevant ground, a discussion of political ideology. The rejection of big money, of course, has little to do with the ideology of individual donors. It's about whether you allow the wealthy to buy political access and influence through contributions.
So the mayor just recently had a fundraiser that was held in a wine cave full of crystals and served $900 a bottle wine. Think about who comes to that. He had promised that every fundraiser he would do would be open door, but this one was closed door. We made the decision many years ago that rich people in smoke-filled rooms would not pick the next president of the United States. Billionaires in wine caves should not pick the next president of the United States.
Mr. Mayor,
This reference to wine cave fundraising was quite effective, as the idea was no doubt mimetic. Not only did other candidates on stage, including Yang and Klobuchar, soon pick up on wine caves as a reference point, the idea spread wildly on the internet. Following the exchange, the hashtag #WineCave quickly began trending on Twitter. Not good for the mayor.
response. You know, according to Forbes magazine, I am literally the only person on this stage who's not a millionaire or a billionaire.
This is, of course, a silly thing to mention. It's relatively irrelevant and requires a little more context to be in any way meaningful. Wealth varies greatly by age, and Pete is by far the youngest on stage at just 37 years old. He's also the only small city mayor on this stage. Andrew Yang, the next youngest on stage at the age of 44, has a net worth of $1 million according to Forbes, and between $800K and $2.4 million according to the Wall Street Journal. As for Buttigieg, Forbes lists him at a net worth of $100,000. They note he has a six-figure annual income, but also at least $100,000 in student loans from his extensive Ivy League education.
So this is important. This is the problem with issuing purity tests you cannot yourself pass.
That's a good point that he'll expound upon later, but first, a worse argument.
If I pledge never to be in the company of a progressive Democratic donor, I couldn't be up here. Senator, your net worth is 100 times mine. Now,
True.
Supposing that you went home feeling the holiday spirit, I know this isn't likely, but stay with me, and decided to go on to PeteForAmerica.com and give the maximum allowable by law, $2,800. Would that pollute my campaign because it came from a wealthy person? No, I would be glad to have that support. We need the support from everybody who is committed to helping us defeat Donald Trump.
That's not a good argument in my view. I don't think most wealthy donors donate to political causes for whatever reasons he and Warren might agree to pretend she might donate for. Big money donors, and more importantly bundlers, cannot be expected, I believe, to be doing this purely out of the goodness of their own hearts. Are there wealthy people who donate just because they believe in someone or something? Sure, maybe. But to believe that big money does not corrupt, you have to expect they are all doing it just out of the goodness of their own hearts. You also have to believe that constantly rubbing shoulders with the wealthy and well-connected has no effect on a politician. That's extremely far-fetched, in my view.
We would like to bring in everyone, but obviously, Senator Warren, I'd like to give you a chance to respond.
I do not sell access to my time. I don't do call time with millionaires and billionaires.
Sorry, as of when, Senator?
Oh, there he goes, teasing the damaging point again.
I don't meet behind closed doors with big dollar donors. And look, I've taken one that ought to be an easy step for everyone here. I've said to anyone who wants to donate to me, if you want to donate to me, that's fine. But don't come around later expecting to be named ambassador, because that's what goes on in these high dollar fundraisers. I said no, and I asked everybody on this stage to join me. This ought to be an easy step, and here's the problem. If you can't stand up and take the steps that are relatively easy, can't stand up to the wealthy and well-connected when it's relatively easy when you're a candidate, then how can the American people believe you're going to stand up to the wealthy and well-connected when you're president and it's really hard?
The point she makes here is significant. Warren is pointing out that if wealthy people want to donate to her or Buttigieg, that's fine. There's no difference there. The difference is that he's actively pursuing the wealthy and well-to-do in these fundraisers, where well-to-do donors get a unique level of access to the candidates. I do think that this is a notable difference. It does appear to make Pete less trustworthy for ordinary folks.
Senator, I've got to respond.
Mr. Mayor, we're going to give you one more chance to respond.
If you can't say no to a donor, then you have no business running for office in the first place. But also, Senator, your presidential campaign right now, as we speak, is funded in part by money you transferred, having raised it at those exact same big-ticket fundraisers you now denounce.
That is absolutely correct. She in fact did transfer over $10.4 million to her presidential campaign from her 2018 Senate run, and some of that cash was raised from big money donors. While some may see her changing stance on big money as an improvement in her integrity, others, I believe, will see her as hypocritical.
Did it corrupt you, Senator? Of course not.
Beg to differ.
So to denounce the same kind of fundraising guidelines that President Obama went by, that Speaker Pelosi goes by, that...
Do you trust that Obama and Pelosi are perfect for the people politicians who have never caved to corporate pressure?
You yourself went by until not long ago in order to build the Democratic Party and build a campaign ready for the fight of our lives. These purity tests shrink the stakes of the most important election.
Judy.
I really object to that. The idea that campaign finance is not important, that not taking big money is simply a purity test, is silly. The idea that fundraising has nothing to do with the stakes of the election itself is also silly, I think. Personally, judging from, for example, the major issue raised over Clinton's Wall Street speeches, and the big deal Trump made of his own self-funding, and his drain the swamp rhetoric, I would wager that where the money comes from strongly affects the electability of a candidate. In a big way, Trump ran against the systemic corruption of Washington, which is largely fueled by big money in politics. A grassroots-funded campaign could remove a major talking point from Trump's campaign, while taking big money could give him a fantastic talking point to use.
We'd like to bring everyone in. We'd like to bring everyone in. We'd like to bring everyone in, but Senator Klobuchar had your hand up first.
I did not come here to listen to this argument.
Okay, sorry Amy, let's move on to our last exchange of the night. A conflict that was not between candidates, but rather one candidate and one moderator. Bernie Sanders versus Amna Nawaz. The hostility between Bernie Sanders and the moderators was palpable in several moments throughout the debate. At one point, Sanders rejected the framing of a question on climate change presented by Tim Alberta, specifically the focusing in on relocating citizens from devastated areas. A number of the moderators, most especially Judy Woodruff in my view, also asked several questions with rather right-wing framing, suggesting for instance that Nancy Pelosi is about as worker-friendly as it gets, suggesting that the legitimate economists are the ones who oppose wealth taxes, and regularly characterizing bold progressive changes as impractical. The most obvious conflict between Sanders and the moderators came, of course, after Amna Nawaz asked Bernie this question.
Senator Sanders, I do want to put the same question to you, Senator Sanders. What message do you think?
Answer that question.
Hold up. First, let's back up to the question being asked in the first place when it was addressed to Andrew Yang.
I want to switch topics to you, Mr. Yang. A new question. The Democratic Party relies on Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters, but you are the only candidate of color on the stage tonight, and the entire field remains overwhelmingly white. What message do you think this sends to voters of color?
Okay, so this question was obviously posed because of the reaction to the lineup for this debate. After Kamala Harris dropped out of the race and Cory Booker and Julian Castro didn't qualify, suddenly Yang became the only non-white person on the debate stage. I should point out that while I agree that it is problematic to have minorities underrepresented amongst the candidates, I do think the framing of this question is a little silly. The candidates for president for any party should be the best available options who self-select to run. The problem is not that there aren't enough token this or that on stage, there are far more fundamental issues causing the disparity in the first place. In my view, Democrats should be far less worried about what the racial makeup of their candidates say to voters, and far more worried about why people of color are less likely to get into positions of power. That said, despite the fact that this segment is about Bernie Sanders and the moderators, I want to show Yang's response to this question. First, because as a relatively conflict-free candidate who is often ignored by the mainstream media, I believe he just plain deserves the attention. And second, because his answer to the question is really excellent in my view. The question was somewhat superficial, but he grounds it with more important information.
It's both an honor and disappointment to be the lone candidate of color on the stage tonight. I miss Kamala, I miss Cory, though I think Cory will be back. I grew up the son of immigrants, and I had many racial epithets used against me as a kid. But Black and Latinos have something much more powerful working against them than words. They have numbers. The average net worth of a Black household is only 10% that of a white household. For Latinos, it's 12%. If you're a Black woman, you're 320% more likely to die from complications in childbirth. These are the numbers that define race in our country. And the question is, why am I the lone candidate of color on this stage? Fewer than 5% of Americans donate to political campaigns. You know what you need to donate to political campaigns? Disposable income. The way we fix this is we take Martin Luther King's message of a guaranteed minimum income, a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month for all Americans. I guarantee if we had a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month, I would not be the only candidate of color on this stage tonight.
So as you see, Yang didn't answer the specific question of what message is this sending, which is really a silly question. Instead, he used the opportunity to talk about racial inequity and point out that the fundamental problem here is the racial wealth gap. So after Yang does a great job of answering this question, the moderators turn to the only other minority on stage, Bernie Sanders. Sanders has, of course, often spoken about and supported policies around fixing exactly what Yang talked about in his response, the gap in wealth among Blacks, Latinos, and whites.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Senator Sanders, I do want to put the same question to you, Senator Sanders. What message do you think?
I will answer that question, but I wanted to get back to the issue of climate change for a moment, because I do believe this is the existential issue.
So right there, in the moment, it looks like Sanders is attempting to sidestep the issue and talk about an unrelated topic, the topic that was being discussed just prior to this one. While this kind of thing might annoy people, it is rather routine in presidential debates. For example, Elizabeth Warren had just done this earlier in the debate.
Senator Warren, you have your hand up.
I do.
And I have a question for you.
Well, I want to ask this question.
Go ahead.
Because here's the problem.
Okay, so Warren wanted to talk about something other than the question the moderator had in mind, and in this instance, the response is go ahead, go ahead. Let's see if Bernie gets the same treatment.
What message do you think?
I will answer that question, but I wanted to get back to the issue of climate change for a moment, because I do believe this is the existential issue.
Senator, with all respect, this question is about race. Can you answer the question as it was asked?
Yeah, so obviously here Bernie did not get the same treatment either by the moderators or by the crowd. The moderators told Warren go ahead. They told Bernie with all due respect. The crowd stayed silent as Warren shifted to talk about what she wanted to talk about. They jeered rather obnoxiously when Bernie was called out for doing the same. Still, I have to acknowledge, even though Sanders is my favorite candidate running for president at the moment, even if the moderators are being unfair in their enforcement of this stay-on-topic policy, I do like such a policy being enforced. I want politicians, including Bernie Sanders, to answer the questions they are being asked, and I hate to see them avoiding important issues. And yet we should ask, was Bernie really trying to sidestep talking about race? Well, let's see.
Because people of color, in fact, are going to be the people suffering most if we do not deal with climate change.
Okay, so either Sanders came up with a totally different talking point from the one he was planning on putting out 3 seconds before he got called out by the moderator, or he was, as I suspect, all along going to bring up climate change only to tie into race issues. After all, the connections between race and climate change are significant, and an issue addressed quite extensively in, for example, the Green New Deal, a resolution Sanders did a lot of work to promote in early days. Now, it would be quite possible, of course, that Sanders just tagged that on to open a speech about climate change on the fly, So if the rest of what he had to say was about climate change and not race, it seems to me that he was probably initially attempting to sidestep the question about race. But was that the case? Well, you be the judge.
And by the way, we have an obligation up here, if there are not any of our African American brothers and sisters up here, to speak about an economy in which African Americans are exploited, where black women die 3 times at higher rates than white women, where we have a criminal justice system which is racist and broken, disproportionately made up of African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans who are in jail. So we need an economy that focuses on the needs of oppressed, exploited people, and that is the African American community.
Okay, so to be frank, that wasn't an amazing speech about race. He brought up some points about racial inequality in terms of income, healthcare, and criminal justice, but didn't go into all that much depth or have anything particularly special to say on these issues. Now you could, if you wish, believe that he just improvised that speech from the top of his head in reaction to the crowd and moderator reacting negatively to his attempt to shift the issue over to climate change. But to believe that, you have to also acknowledge these two things. First, it's obvious that although his speech was not particularly powerful, he still obviously had enough familiarity with these issues surrounding race to touch upon some key issues. This is not only necessarily the case because we just witnessed it, we also know he's knowledgeable about these topics through his interviews with The Breakfast Club and Killer Mike, and he no doubt learned a thing or two about black people working as closely as he has with Nina Turner. He also has numerous policy proposals addressing racial justice on his website, subcategorized into the following areas: voting rights and enfranchisement, criminal justice, environmental justice, healthcare disparities, and economic justice. You'll note that in that little speech, Sanders touched on 4 out of the 5 topics, beginning with environmental justice. Which brings us to the second thing to acknowledge. If you believe that he was trying to sidestep the topic of race, you have to believe that he was doing this for basically no good reason. He certainly does not want for things to talk about in this arena. He has pages of policy to speak about. He does not have the same kinds of skeletons in his closet in regards to the issue, as for example Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg. Perhaps his biggest issue having to do with race was his inability to earn sufficient support from older black voters in the 2016 primary. Yet in this primary cycle, Sanders has gained ground with black voters, for example beating out Kamala Harris 2-1 amongst black voters at the peak of her popularity. This has been a result of a concerted effort from Sanders to reach out more effectively to black voters, a priority he's mentioned having on more than one occasion. So you are welcome to believe that Sanders was trying to sidestep the issue of race, but to do so you also have to imagine that Sanders was behaving quite illogically in doing so, while at the same time having enough wherewithal to improvise a speech in a split second that mentions 4 out of the 5 issues relating to racial policy identified on his website. Or you could believe, as I do, that Nawaz was overreaching and trying to create a moment, and the crowd bought in hook, line, and sinker. Now, I don't blame Nawaz or the crowd for mistaking his first line as a dodge. It certainly did sound like it. But after assessing what he had to say next, I find it very difficult to believe that he didn't plan the whole time to make his answer focus on race. So in the moment, I don't really think anyone did anything wrong here. The only people I would criticize would be those who would try to use this somewhat awkward moment to propagandize a narrative that Sanders is incapable of addressing racial issues. We saw him do it here and elsewhere in the debate. He was one of 4 out of these 7 candidates to talk about race in this debate. We've seen him talk about race in other debates as well, and in plenty of other forums. And lest we forget, these issues are quite obviously significant to him personally, as his first real foray into activism was his minor leadership role in the civil rights movement during his college years, decades before he could have possibly imagined running for president. Now, my opinion appears to be in the minority on this, as several outlets have characterized Sanders as attempting to dodge questions about race. A satirical Twitter thread I stumbled upon called MSDNC characterized the mainstream media's mood this way: Sanders attempts to dodge race question by answering race question. Indeed, Chris Cillizza characterized Sanders as the only loser of the debate, other than the first hour and Pete Buttigieg, who he also considered to be a winner, in part because, as he claimed, Sanders got shut down by one of the debate moderators for trying to pivot from a question about race to talk about the climate crisis. Clearly, there are quite divergent opinions on this matter, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. What happened?